This is actually sort of difficult for me. I'm never good following videos. Thank you very much. Because I want to talk about everything that we saw. I want to deconstruct little words and like you heard, who was the football coach say, football is football. That tells us a lot, right? And it was Joe Girardi, the manager of the Yankees, who said that boys will be boys. What does that mean? And I may talk about that to some great extent later on. But I do want to tell you why I identify as a feminist and why I am very, very proud to, when I was first nominated for the College Football Hall of Fame, I was like, come on, like, that's never going to happen, but it's pretty nice that you say that. But I was very glad that someone did that because it allowed me to say that I was nominated for the College Football Hall of Fame and I am a feminist. And now I get to say that I am a Hall of Famer and a feminist. And the reason why I say I'm proud to say that is because it speaks to something that I've tried for most of my life to try to do, and that's kind of make people think a little bit differently about how we stereotype or how we label people, all those little boxes, and I may talk a little bit more about that box in a little while, about who we are based on our affiliation and what we do or what we choose to wear or how we speak or where we come from. And I've always had a big problem with that, with labeling people and reducing people. And in terms of getting involved in issues like men's violence against women and being an activist to some extent, a lot of that didn't come from, although I grew up, again, in that understanding of stereotypes and racism in the larger context in our society. I grew up as a child. I was born in 1965, and I grew up on Long Island in a fairly middle-class black neighborhood on Long Island that we had a member of the New York Yankees, a member of the Denver Broncos, who was a local guy. Floyd Patterson lived in the neighborhood. So we were just kind of middle-class, run-of-the-mill black folks on Long Island, but it was early 1970s, and I knew what a nigger was, and I knew I was one. And I saw dogs being turned on black people in Montgomery, Alabama, and Selma, Alabama, and hoses being turned on people. So I understood that. And I understood the powerful impact of that kind of division and that kind of hate and that kind of tone. And yet, I was a young kid whose mother is the product of an interracial marriage, whose father is the product of an interracial marriage. My one grandmother was white, English. My other grandmother was Chinese. All grew up in Jamaica. Do you believe this? My two grandmothers played soccer on the same soccer team in Jamaica. Seriously. And they kind of like grew up like in Jamaica, like this white woman or white girl and Chinese girl grew up playing soccer together and went to school together in Jamaica in Lord knows what year that was, right? But ended up knew each other a little bit in Jamaica, came to New York, in Brooklyn, and introduced their children to one another. And here I am. And so I was always struck with that, all the isms and the obias, and that's kind of how I got involved in social justice issues to some extent. And as a student athlete, was going out with a program in New York State called Athletes Against Drunk Driving, and I was going to schools talking to students too young to drink and too young to drive about drunk driving. And as I say all the time, the only thing I knew about drunk driving at the time was how to do it. And I realized that we weren't giving young people good information or accurate information to help them make good decisions around complex social issues. We were using that very simplistic language, or what I refer to as prevention language, just say no, or don't do this or don't do that. And very often waiting for something bad to happen before we had a conversation about important social issues. And I was doing quote unquote prevention programs. And to me, I didn't think we were really preventing anything. And so I got more and more involved in some of these issues, and then I got locked into, and I say locked into because to me it was kind of the ultimate of everything that I was doing, this issue of men's violence against women and talking about masculinity and how we raise boys in the culture and all that. And I'm going to kind of, towards the end, kind of end with that point because it gets to I think, a very important point. And I am also going to do something that I don't do very often, and that is look at notes. Because this is an issue that can go in so many different directions. And it is a conversation that can go in so many different directions, whether you're talking about racism or sexism with some of the kind of underlying issues to some of the conflict that you saw in that video. And so it really can go in a lot of different directions. But I want to really speak to you about, someone asked me earlier, where are you, if there was a moment that really got me into this kind of work, and this issue in particular of sport. When I was in college, I told you I was working with athletes against drunk driving, and then started working with a program called Athletes Helping Athletes, and we were training high school student athletes to go into elementary schools. And I started doing this in about 1988, 1989. When I was a rookie in the NFL, I started doing more and more of this program, and I loved it because I was empowering and helping to empower and educate high school students to go in and talk to younger students about making good decisions. Again, giving them more information to make better decisions, as opposed to just saying no and telling them to stay away from whatever. And in the process of that program, I would go train high school student athletes, and we'd bring them into the elementary school, and then they would go into the 5th grade class and do a workshop with the 5th graders. And we would do that a number of times during the year, and as I got a little bit more seasoned in that program, I used to go in and actually talk to the 5th grade students, but then I started staying in the hallway and watching the high school students as they got better at the program. And there was one particular time, and at the time it was 1992, I was playing in the Canadian Football League. I was during the off season. I was on Long Island, not too far from where I live now. And I was in the hallway, and I was listening to these two students, high school students, having a difficult time in the class of 5th graders. And there was one particular group of 3 or 4 boys who were just being really difficult. And so I let them go for one to see how well I had trained them to deal with this and manage the classroom. And after a while, I poked my head in, and I kind of engaged class. And as soon as I walked into the room, these 3 boys locked in on me. And they started, who are you? And eventually one of the high school students told them that I played professional football. And these boys started to say the typical questions that I would get from kids. What do you think the first one is? Probably the one that even adults ask.
Who'd you play for?
Who'd you play for? What position do you play? What else?
How tall are you?
How tall are you? Who said it? How much money do you make? How much? It didn't go to how tall you are. And this was the thing that really bothered me. And this was one of those moments. I think if there was any moment that really was the moment that made me say I have to quit playing football, it was this moment. Because it wasn't how tall are you, how far can you throw the ball. These were 10-year-old boys, and they started with how much money do you make? I was, at the time, the 2nd or 3rd highest paid player in the Canadian Football League. I was making about $250,000 a year in Canada. So those of you who are concerned about taxes in this current election, let me tell you what I was paying in taxes in Canada in 1990. 51% of my salary. And I didn't live there. I would see people in the streets who would have like a cup, and I'd be like, you have some of my money already. That's cold, but that's how I felt. Like, man, 50, I don't even live here. I live here half the year. So I lived there half the year playing football, right? I had a house, because I just left the Philadelphia Eagles. I had a house in South Jersey that I was paying a mortgage on. But I worked, and this event took place on Long Island. So I had an apartment on Long Island. I had a house in New York, in New Jersey that I owned, and I still had an apartment in Canada because I was playing football there half the year. So I was making $250,000. Half of that went to the government. I had to pay for living expenses and car and everything else. And when I came across the border, unlike today, the dollar was worth $1.20 in Canada. Excuse me, it was worth 78 cents in Canada. So when I took my money from Canada to cross the border, my dollar was only worth 78 cents. So I really, at the end of the day, didn't have much money. And these kids, when they asked me how much money I made, I'm going to tell you kind of the long story of this, but they asked me how much money I made, they started with $10 million a year. This was in 1992. And I said no. And I went on to talk to some other kids who were much better behaved because I didn't feel like dealing with these kids. And then they went from 10 million to 9 million to 8 million. Every time I said no, they got down to like 4 million. They started giving me 3.5, 3.4. These are 10-year-old kids who were giving me increments of $100,000. And when they got to about 3.2, and I still said no, they went, pfft. And my heart sank. Not because these kids dissed me. Because these 10-year-olds, that's what they thought. I remember a guy named Billy Taylor, who subsequently was someone I worked with in doing this work in school, played for the New York Giants. And when I was a senior in high school, Billy Taylor and the New York Giants came to my high school and played a basketball game. I still have the program from that day. I still have a trophy that a guy that played with my brother, of course now his name is escaping me, played for the Rams, signed because he came to my Little League awards dinner and signed this trophy, this little plaque. I still have it. Because those guys meant something. It wasn't money. It wasn't how much money do you make or what kind of car do you drive or what. And it hit me that this is the value system that these kids were living with. This is what they thought I represented walking in the room. And I started thinking about all the other things that I represented walking in the room for them. All the other issues that were going on with athletes. And this was a year before OJ. And all the other things that were going on in the public about sports. Was I that guy to them? What was I to them? And that was that probably, if anything, of that moment where I really went home thinking to myself, I've got to get out of this. I spend my time during the off season talking to kids about important social issues. And you know what? They're walking away going, we didn't hear a word he said about drunk driving or alcohol or his friends that died from ODing from drugs or the things that happened in his life that were so important with the reason I was there. They didn't hear any of that. They saw some two-bit football player from Canada. That's all they saw. And I started thinking about what was the role and the function of sport in our society. And let me just, before I get into a little bit of a rant, you can tell it might be coming. And I'm going to go back to your question from last night, because I think it really is an important question about why I'm here. I am a feminist. I am an activist. About a month ago, I was in Texas Council on Family Violence. It is where my heart really, on a daily basis of the work that I some days wish I could be doing more of, is around men's violence against women and around masculinity and talking to young men and boys around these issues. But I also know that a big part of my appeal in doing that, a big part of my voice in doing that, is because I was a All-American quarterback and Hall of Famer and all of that on the sports side. My credibility, in many ways, that is a hook to have a larger dialogue around domestic violence and men's violence against women, is still, in many ways, based in this assumption that sports is good for people. This assumption that we are good guys in sports. And so what you're doing, competition, not conflict, is bringing back and enabling us to get back to that once altruistic, and I will say this, it's an assumed altruism of sports. And I say assumed altruism of sports because I will tell you this just because as an aside, you see the misbehavior of athletes. Athletes today on the professional and college level are better behaved than ever before in the history of sports, without question. The athletes of my era and my predecessors would not withstand the media scrutiny of today. Not even close. When I was with the Philadelphia Eagles, I replaced 2 windshields in my car, dragging friends of mine from bars where they got in fights. I had teammates both in Syracuse and with the Philadelphia Eagles who were stabbed in fights mid-season. I had one teammate who used to carry an AK-47 in his trunk. One time came to training camp with a bazooka in his trunk. I kid you not. I'm not smart enough to make some of this stuff up. And the behavior of athletes of years past, who would play in major games drunk and drink the night before until the next morning, would not withstand today. The behavior and the attitudes of athletes of the past would not withstand today. So on the one hand, as people tend to think that it's getting worse at that level, they know that people are watching at that level. I'll tell you where it's getting worse is on the youth level. Because there's an assumption on the youth level that that's what it's supposed to be, that that's what it's all about. And I'm going to get into that assumption in a little while. But I want to really kind of bring you to, and I started to say something, I want to make sure I didn't, so just to kind of to finish on that point, that what you all are doing here in restoring the altruism to sport, of sport supports what I do. And people like myself and organizations that I used to work for, like the Center for the Study of Sport Society, and other organizations and other individuals like Richard Lapchick, who's a great activist, someone I worked with for many years, who uses the power of sport to address social issues. Well, if sport is just a bunch of thugs and a bunch of violent people who are greedy for money and all these things, then it's no longer there for the people who want to use it to address issues like racism and sexism and homophobia and all the other issues that we deal with. And so what you all are doing is critically important to holding up and holding up sport in a place where other people like myself choose to use it to better society. But I will tell you that part of what happened and how we got here, and this is my brief moment, I won't take a long time because I don't think that I really want to, but I want to give you kind of a sense of how we got to this point. And one of the saddest things that I ever heard, I had a mother, excuse me, at a school on Long Island say to me, and I was talking to a group of parents, and she said, well, what about, kids who just aren't good enough? And I said, well, what do you mean? She goes, well, my son he's just not good enough to play. And I said, how old is your son? And she said, he was like 6 or 7. And I looked at this woman, and sometimes you have that moment where you see someone, especially like we see parents, and we go, what is wrong with this person, right? And I'm a parent, I get it. Sometimes kids make you lose your mind and you start saying things over and over and over and things like that, right? But this woman actually said that her son wasn't good enough to play, and I looked at her, and it was one of those moments where I almost started crying. I was like, how is it your child is not good enough to play? Bless you. I'm going to say this again. To play. This is not brain surgery. This is not life or death. This is not war. This is play. And we have said that certain children aren't good enough to play. And this happened at a time, as I say, that how did we get here? I really do believe that I was a part of it. As I said about the behavior of my teammates, the part of it in the late 1980s when a number of different things happened in our culture. Sport got commodified because all of a sudden we were making a lot of money from it. And it became a huge generator. And it happened at a time when television got very stale. The shows like MASH and like, God love it, All in the Family, my favorite show ever. Those shows got very stale. Television got very predictable. And television was going through a little transition as well with cable and HBO, and this whole transition of media began to happen. And the media landscape started to get more obtuse with cable, so there were more networks out there. And so there was greater competition to maintain freshness in television. And now we see what we have is what do you call it? Reality television, right? That's really not reality at all. None of it is. Do you know there's only one reality television? You know what reality television tries to do in shows like ER, or not ER, but like, what's that one with the people on the island?
Survivor.
Not Survivor. No, the one of the people on the plane that crashed. Lost, right? Lost that I got into for like a year because it was good, right? And you really thought that they were going to get off the island or something was going to happen. Then they just said they had to make some crazy thing up, right? Because you know why? They were making money and people watching. And so they had to extend the show and get you hooked. So there really was no end in sight. And so people like me were like, You know why? I want my reality programming to be reality. I want to start at 2:30. I want to be finished by 6. I want to know everything is done. There's only one thing on television that does that. Not even a presidential debate because you don't get the answer. Right? Sports. The original reality television. The only reality television. And in the early 90s, exploded. And another thing happened at that same time was the lie of sports, because there were so many other things that we could make money off of it. And so we started telling parents that if your child specializes in one sport, the lie. There's only one reason why I played in the NFL. There's only one reason why I was able to play at the level of football I played. And I had nothing to do with it. I was blessed by God to be able to throw the ball far, to run the ball, run a little faster, to recognize one helmet going across the middle and find that spot where that ball belonged. That was it. I had nothing to do with that. Did I work hard? Absolutely. I worked no harder than you did as a little boy or you did as a little girl because you love to play. It was God-given ability. I can't do math. I was a quarterback, and if it was 2nd and 7 and we got 5, and someone said, how far do we have to go for the first down? That line right there. Don't ask me to do math. Did you notice that? It was there today, this afternoon, when one of the athletes said something about giving that guy some math, and he looked at him with a deer in the headlights. 805 times. I don't know what that is. It was God-given ability. It wasn't that I worked hard. It wasn't any of that. But we have sold this lie to our kids that if you specialize in one sport, you can get that scholarship, or there's some money at the end of the rainbow. And so you have kids specializing in sports, and you have all these kind of stress-related injuries with kids that we haven't seen before. We have all this. If you want to talk about parents losing their mind, you know why those parents lose their mind in some ways? Because they spend a lot of money they shouldn't have spent for their kids to play that sport or to specialize in that sport, or put their kid in a camp all summer or winter long because they're specializing in a sport and they're doing it year round. And that kid is traveling all over the country to be or all over the region to be on a travel team. And we used to say sport builds community, right? What about travel teams? And where I live on Long Island, we have so many little communities, I'm sure you have them here as well, where there's 2 girls in this town who are really good at softball. And you know what? If we take them out of that town and bring them to this town, we might have a team that could go to Portland. So what happens to all the other girls in that town who can't field the team? What about building community? What about lifting each other up? What about team? It's not about the team anymore. It's about the individual. And a big part of what the business of sport did is we decentralized, and what happened in the 90s is we decentralized the prize. The prize used to be the championship. And that one banner that we all stood under. The prize was no longer the championship. It was no longer the ring. It was no longer the trophy. The prize was the dollar. So there were incentives on contracts that if you had so many catches, or if you had scored so many points. There were, the prize was the NFL contract, or the NBA contract. Was decentralized. The prize for that one student, one of those girls in that community, was to go and play on that team to get a scholarship so that she can go on and play college ball. So the prize is no longer about the community and the pride of the town. The prize is about the individual achievement. And you will hear me talk, having a strong understanding, and Cheney and I spoke about this, and Sandy spoke about this yesterday in the car driving down here. I am someone who, as I was observing all this, I can put it to markers. I can blame ESPN, and I've said this to people in their face about how they oversaturated this message about how we make instant heroes of athletes. But there were other messages that were very large in the culture, and there was a one person and one company at the same time in the late 80s that changed a lot of the way we talked around sport, and it was Nike. And Michael Jordan. The NBA was failing. The NBA was a horrible league. It was full of drug addicts and violent guys and thugs, and that was the image of the league. And along came, and it had Bird and Magic, and that was great. But then along came Michael Jordan. And you know what the NBA did for Michael Jordan? Does anybody know what the NBA did? They changed the rules. They changed the defensive rules in the NBA so that Michael Jordan can go one-on-one against somebody in the league. And it was so the whole, you could have 8 guys on one side of the court, you just went over here and picked their nose. Michael Jordan went one-on-one over there. You know why? Because they needed that hero. And Nike was attached to it. And they got into this, and like nothing else, Michael Jordan took off. Just do it. Let me just break down Just Do It for you for a second. It is, and let me just say, when I talk about Nike, I think that I don't think that what Nike did was of malicious intent. It was a business. And that business was to sell sneakers. And by the way, the business of the shoe industry in sports, again, part of the lie of sports, was one of the greatest scams perpetrated on America. That you needed a different shoe to walk, a different shoe to walk, to jog a little faster, a different shoe to walk a little quicker than you walked, right? A different shoe then you needed a cross trainer, because God forbid you should walk and want to hop, right? Right? And so we were sold all these different needs for these different shoes I walk around a pair of Chuck Taylors. I wear them now, and all like younger kids, like my nieces and nephews, think, "What are you doing in Chuck?" I'm like, "I wore Chucks before you would, you know." And remember Chuck Taylors? Julius Erving took off from the foul line in Chuck Taylors. He didn't have that technology that y'all created up here in Beavertown or Beaverton or wherever, Beaverville, right? He took off in Chuck Taylors and flew just as high, just as far as Michael Jordan. Right, but then there was this line of the shoe, and this is not just Nike, but the shoe industry, that we needed a different kind of shoe. You needed, again, specialization, right? So there's an explosion of this what now was this great market of sports. But then Michael Jordan just do it. A few years ago, the Boston Red Sox. Any Boston Red Sox fans here? Oh, you poor, silly, sorry. How long was the drought, sir? How long was the drought before the World Series? How long was the drought? 75 years, right? I lived in Boston and worked at WBZ doing sports radio for a while when I was working at Northeastern, and I used to listen to all these Boston fans. I didn't know how deep this was, how deep-seated this was, and these were very sad people. I, give you credit. Right? And I would listen to them lament about this. What's that? Now you're a racist. But I would listen to them lament about all the stuff that the curse and all the mistakes along the line and the Buckner thing, and I'm friends with Mookie Wilson and I knew about the Buckner thing. This is Boston sports history that y'all may not care about. But this was the situation was horrible in Boston. And when they won the World Series, I get emotional about certain things, different things that are silly. Always movies on a plane do get me. When the Boston Red Sox won the World Series, I cried. I was happy for all the people I knew in Boston. I was happy for them. I was like, man, these people finally came. And they were the most obnoxious people when they lost. I was so glad I was living in New York when it happened. But when it happened, Nike had a commercial ready. And it was this quick montage. It was a 60-second commercial, but it was a 60-second commercial that focused on two seats of a family of people who owned those seats. Right, so it was a mother and father or a dad and his buddies, and at the bottom it had the year, like 1875, whatever. and then the commercial was, fast forward. It showed the years ticking forward, and all the people who would come and go, and the guy getting old, you see him get there, he disappeared, and there's the kids moving in, right? And it was like this really fast moving commercial, and then it got to the year when they won it, and there's just an explosion of 2006 or 7 or whatever it was that they won it, and then it said, just do it. What? It took 75 years. Right? And Nike has these commercials where they show people getting up at 5 in the morning and 4 in the morning and going out and getting their shoes on and running. And they've done a great job with bringing women into sport and promoting the kind of the altruism and the excitement of sport. And they show these people busting their rear ends. And they say, just do it. Sport is not an event. It is not a moment. It is not something you just do. It is a process. It is something you do every single day. If you are an athlete and you are someone who's engaged in sports, you think about it all the time. Because it's part of as you see so many athletes who compare their sport with music, it's part of the rhythm of who they are. I remember a guy who won the gold medal in the quarter-mile hurdles named Derek Atkins, who happens to be from my hometown. And they named the street after him, which really bothered me, because why is they named the street after him? Like a little cul-de-sac or something. But when Derek Atkins won the gold medal in the Olympics, he was talking about the rhythm and jazz and the rhythm of his sport. And the people who are runners, the people who go out, who get up at 5 in the morning, they worry about their diet, they worry about how they eat. It impacts their whole life. It is a process. And when I talked to the football team this afternoon, one of the things I talked about was pay attention to that process. That process that we deal with on a daily basis in sport. You don't learn the day you take an exam. You learn preparing for that exam. And you also learn how to learn in that process. You don't get better on game day. You don't get better on the day of the marathon. That's the day you prove how much work you put into that moment, preparing for that moment. And we have been sold that sport is an event. So not only do we have these messages about just do it and being sold on the commodification of sport and being sold these instant heroes that have no track record, like Kobe Bryant, where millions of kids are walking around in different communities around this country wearing a number 8 LA Laker jersey on, long before their parents talk to them about intimacy, relationships, sexual behavior. As I joke with one of my best friends, and I tend to say things that offend people, so I apologize if I do so, but long before parents even talk to their boys about why they got an erection, they had to answer why they put a jersey on that kid of someone who's charged with rape. Because we were sold him as some sort of hero, as some great guy that our kids should automatically look up to because he was an athlete. Not because he was an athlete, but because he wore a jersey that was on TV that we could sell you and make money. Not that there was any responsibility in that person that we put out there. And so we have that. And we have this mix of sport as entertainment and not of all those altruistic things that we once believed. And when I started teaching a class at Adelphi University a few years ago, I started teaching a class called Sport and Civility. And the first question that and most of my students were either graduate students in physical education or undergrad in phys ed, and a few athletes. And I would ask them the question because they were all about to go into this world of teaching in physical education. And I would say, is sports good for kids? And they would automatically raise their hand. And that was my semester. Teaching them that if you don't proactively teach those things, I think that sports is actually bad for kids. If we don't proactively teach the expectations that we have for sport, the messages that the general population now give in sport, I believe are bad. It's selfish, it's self-absorbed, it's violent, it's actually unrepentant violence. You don't best your opponent, you don't compete, you destroy your opponent. You annihilate your opponent. It was very interesting to hear Coach Bellotti talk about, I want to teach my men how to lose with grace. That's something that we're not allowed to do. Talk about losing. We don't use that language. It's almost not American, by the way. I'm just going to take a very, very scary step and say that it is one of those things that we even hear in the campaign. We don't hear him say the word win. What does win mean? I win, you lose? I win, you die? We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to have that dialogue. There is that, what you said yesterday in the backseat of the car, which was so much about what we've done with sport, this zero-sum game. And in that, we lose and miss the most important thing about sport, and that is it is a process, as I mentioned. Every single day, it is a process. And it's the little things that we teach, and why I say if you don't proactively teach the things that you want to get out of sport. If we believe, and I will give you one, and I will use this as an example, as I said that I would get back to something that was said, boys will be boys. If we believe that sports builds character and builds leadership and builds, and as I was raised in it, builds men of character and leadership in sport. And the National Football Foundation and the College Football Hall of Fame was founded by General MacArthur and talks about building men through football. And I will say in general, and this was something I wrote after the incident at Duke University, where we blamed Duke University, and I blamed myself, and I blamed Long Island, because 14 of those 47 young men on that lacrosse team were from Long Island, and some of them went to schools where I had programs. And I blame myself. I don't blame Duke University, because Duke University didn't teach those young men what it meant to be a man. They grew up in my neighborhood, or in neighborhoods near mine. And we say sports builds character, it builds leadership. Where was the character and the leadership in that locker room? Not at the night of the incident, but planning the incident. Where was the character? Where was the leadership? Said, you know what, this is wrong. This is not how we are supposed to behave. We're supposed to be better than this, aren't we? Are we not? And we say that sports is supposed to build those things. And I'll give you a really fundamental reason why I say if you don't proactively teach those things. What was said at the beginning? Boys will be boys and football is football. These two statements that mean absolutely nothing. Boys will be boys. And I told you I would end with that. And I don't mean necessarily end with that statement, but we often use the term boys will be boys when boys are doing what? Fighting or what else? Mischief. Something stupid. Right? Seriously, I mean, it's not, and occasionally it could be something really, really good. And boys will be boys. It could be good. It's like the word dude, right? You can change the tone to make it mean something different. Why do we use a statement that means absolutely nothing when boys are doing something wrong? Because we don't want to hold them accountable for their behavior. We live in a patriarchal society that says that men are in charge and what we do is right. And what our boys do is okay as long as, boys will be boys. As long as they're not sissies. And it gets to one of the points that why I say one of those things that if we don't proactively teach what we expect out of sports, that the messages of the larger culture are going to teach them very dangerous messages. And when I started doing work around men's violence against women, I started really thinking about the issue. When I learned about attitudes of men, and the attitudes of men that lead to the violence against women. Right, the attitude of perpetrators, but also of the larger culture that was not addressing the issue. I started thinking about how I learned what it meant to be a man and how I viewed women. And I started thinking back to when I was a little boy. And this gets back to all those little boys you saw in that video who were just trying to play a game. And if the men in the room can think back to that little boy, when you were that little boy, as far back in your memory as you can go, what was the worst insult that you could hear as a little boy, and very often that you heard in those environments?
Throw like a girl.
You throw like a girl. You run like a girl. Don't beat. Stop crying like a little girl. Men, am I wrong? Was there anything worse than that? There was a lot of don'ts. I always say we don't raise boys to be men, we raise boys not to be women. Because we don't say what it means to be a whole man, we just tell boys what not to be, as long as you're not that. So there's a movie in the film The Sandlot, if anyone's ever seen it. And if you haven't seen it, I know some people really smile, right? Because Sandlot's one of my favorite movies because there's no cursing, there's no violence, there's no sex, except when Squints kisses Winnie Peppercorn at the pool. Right? And if you haven't seen it, it's a film about 9 little boys that play baseball in a little raggedy field, The Sandlot, and they play their game. And they don't have an opponent. They just play their game with each other. And then one scene where these boys ride into the Sandlot conflict, right, from another part of town. And the boys ride, and the boys have bicycles, Sandlot boys don't have bikes. The boys have uniforms. The Sandlot boys don't have uniforms. They play in their jeans or whatever, right? And they start throwing insults. And the bicycles come up on the field like in Braveheart when the two armies square up in the field, and they start throwing insults back and forth. Rodriguez, why are you playing with these scrubs? And you're an embarrassment to the game, and you make sandwiches with your mother's toe jam, and you like it, and all these different insults back and forth. And then finally, Ham, the great Hambino, remember the little chubby dude with the freckles? Ham says, "You play ball like a girl." And the music stops. And the kid he said to was physically hit with it. He's like, right? It's like, what did you say? And the next line is, tomorrow, our field, noon. Those are fighting words. The gauntlet had been thrown down. Their masculinity had been challenged. These are 9, 8, 9-year-old boys in this really innocent film. And that language, you play ball like a girl. When I talk about the ultimate insult, you throw like a girl, and I ask this of men across demographics, geography, socioeconomics, class, race, all of it. And I ask that question, the worst insult you ever heard as a little boy is you throw like a girl, or you run like a girl. And then you hear that perpetuated in locker rooms. You hear that perpetuated in media. You see it perpetuated in film around sports. And I can deconstruct so many films for you where that sentiment is repeated over and over and over. And we hear that so often that it's an insult to compare a boy to a girl. And I referred to it at one point, I actually referred to that as the language of sport, because that's where I heard it so often. And that's where it was so socially acceptable, still socially acceptable to say it. Arnold Schwarzenegger called the legislators a bunch of legislative girly men. Right? Seriously. And there was a little bit of, wow, that's offensive. But he did it again at the convention, right? So really not that offensive. Right? Which says that sexism is still okay, but the venue, well, you don't do that not in the legislature. Okay to do it in sports. And that language of what that means, and I refer to it, and I will go very quickly on this point, but that language of you throw like a girl and why it's problematic is one, is that it creates this very narrow understanding of masculinity. That like boys will be boys, we hear you throw like a girl, or don't be, stop crying like a sissy, or why you get so sensitive when men are talking about their emotions, their feelings, and what they care about. And that language, you throw like a girl, you run like a girl, or stop being, is designed to push men back inside this very narrow box of masculinity. Narrowing down who we are, limiting our options. So if some guy calls me a sissy, I'm going to fight him. There's like when in the Sandlot, when some boy said, you play ball like a girl, now it's on. And so when we talk about conflict, how often conflict comes out of a very narrow understanding of self. Because if you call me that name, I'm going to fight you. That is someone with limited options and a very narrow self-identity. And so when I talk about if you don't proactively teach the outcomes that you want, the larger messages that our kids will get can be very dangerous. And this assumption that sports builds that is not true. This assumption that sports builds, by the way, the other point of that, and just to kind of complete that thought, the other point of that language, you throw like a girl, is to say that women and girls are less than, because it's an insult to be called one of them. You can refer to a guy as a truck. You can refer to a guy as, that's my dog, that's my truck, he's a real cool cat, he's a snake. But you compare him to his sister and they're fighting words. That is misogyny, by the way. People say, oh, what does misogyny mean? That means the hatred of women. I don't hate women, I love women. But if someone compares you to one, you're ready to fight. Because that's the last thing you want to be called or compared to. And that language, if you don't believe, if you think that I'm standing here and saying this theoretically, walk into a locker room or walk into a group of where men hang out, hear how often the language that we challenge each other with and that we use with each other is gender-based. And I would tell you in sports media, it is wrought throughout that kind of language, that kind of sentiment. And so I say again, if you don't proactively teach those things that you want, if you say that sports is about building community and building team, then we do have to address issues like travel teams. And if sports is about health and about teaching children to love play, then we have to address specialization. If sports is about family, and it's about God and religion, like what's his name? The great Vince Lombardi would say that sports is about God, family, and football. Life is about God, family, football, but everyone who's ever played for him said on Sundays, his perspectives on practice days, his priorities got all screwed up. If sports is about God, family, our country is about God, family, and our sports, and all that, if all that is true, then sports shouldn't be played on Sundays. Not at the family hour. What is Sunday to us anymore, this Judeo-Christian society that we live in? What is our priority on Sunday? Does Sunday mean church and family? Does Sunday mean that the Sabbath is the synagogue? On the Sabbath is it the synagogue and family? It's football. NFL. Right? And so we have this culture where our values, the very values that we say we rest on very often, are contradicted. And some people will say, well, that's the whole purpose of sport. To push aside those values and have that 3-hour moment where we're allowed to hate each other. And I would buy that if we didn't hate each other more often outside of that. I would buy that if we didn't have a country that's divided by red state and blue state, and we've learned how to hate each other more than we've learned how to love each other. Where it's more popular to say I hate than it is to say I love. Where if our children say I love, they're gay. And that's so gay. Where we're not teaching our children how to love. We're not teaching our children the process of life. And I will tell you this, this is a personal thing, and it's an observation that we don't teach these things. And I tell you this not from some academic perspective of looking at research on it. I tell you this from not just traveling around, but being around and going in and out of different communities and listening to the same things that you all struggle with at Roosevelt. Is it Roosevelt? And the same incidents that happen in community after community, this out of control sports culture that Tori talked about. Where it's become very selfish and very mean and very mean-spirited. And the larger culture is equally as cynical and mean-spirited. And so I can really get on, as you can imagine, I think as I probably demonstrated, a little bit of a continued rant. And I can also give, as I start to those kind of examples of kind of those larger messages, and I talk about Nike and I talk about ESPN, not that they are necessarily the evils in all of this, but that they were drivers in our culture. And I don't think that their intent was malicious, and I don't think that the intent of the business that transformed to industry was malicious. But we do have certain aspects of our culture now that are little head scratchers. The Ohio State University's athletic budget is larger than the city budget in Cleveland and Cincinnati combined. Think about that for a second. This is a nonprofit state institution in Ohio. And the athletic budget is larger than the two largest cities in the state of Ohio. At a time when we have $700 billion bailouts, at a time when people are struggling and in so many other ways, that is thriving. It's overwhelming. And Noah, where are you, Noah? Talked about how overwhelming it is. He asked me, how do you when you go and you talk to people and it's like, you're not going to change that. How are you going to address that? The Ohio State and that budget and that the arms race and college athletics and you all are no different here at Ohio. I'm not going to sit here and say that I come from this altruistic place at Syracuse University. We're trying to raise $1 billion right now. And one thing that we're trying to build are facilities. And Syracuse University, my alma mater, took $3 million from a basketball player who spent about 3 months on campus and never went to a class. But he's an NBA All-Star, and so we'll take your money. To build a place for more people like him to come and spend 3 months in practicing. There's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy in our athletics and higher ed landscape. There's a tremendous amount of head scratchers. How did we get here? And so to Noah's question to me earlier was, how do you begin to unravel that and help young people make good decisions in what seemed all around them to be a consistent message that, hey, that's just the way it is. And it's not going to happen with us doing what I have just done for the past few minutes, a few hours, a few days of ranting about it. It's going to happen with organizations like this doing something about it and speaking about it. And I will say, as I talk about the hypocrisy of athletics and higher education, it's just something that I like to talk about because I think that it is very real and I watch it and I live it, I'm a part of it. But it's not going to happen from people from the outside of athletics throwing stones. It's going to happen from people outside of athletics engaging people within athletics and working together. No different than me as a feminist, as a male, working with women who are doing the work every single day around feminism and violence against women. It's not going to happen with me throwing stones or them throwing stones at me. Women welcome me into that movement, and men like myself. And the same thing is true here, where people who understand conflict resolution, the people who understand how you do deal with. And I said earlier upstairs that I'm not one of those people. I don't have that skill or that understanding. But we have to start partnering with people who have that skill and have that understanding, so that we can preserve the altruism of sport. So we can ensure that it is there for people like myself and other activists who use the power of sport to address different social issues that we find a passion. But it's not going to be there for us if organizations like competition, not conflict, don't thrive and are not successful and not equally a part of the dialogue in our sports culture as the business of sport. And so I am here because what you do, as I've said, supports what I do. I am here because what you do here in Oregon affects where I live. You talked about your daughters, right? And it's no different than for my daughters to have that opportunity to compete. And I am, just so you all don't think that I am totally like this, as someone said to me earlier, what do you say about the criticism that you're just some liberal trying to get everybody to play happy and be nice and all that kind of stuff? There is a part of me that is, and it's like knowing, you know how you have to know yourself and know your addictions and know that you probably should not have that piece of chocolate because you can't have one, right? I am a very, very competitive person. I am like just, and to the point where I have to, right? I have to know, know yourself, and I'm just like, okay, because if we start this, I'm going to win. Right? Otherwise, I started when I was first challenged this with my daughters playing this little game. I don't even know what the game was, but there were like little bugs on little cards, and they had to match them up. And my 2-year-old kept stealing cards, and I kept taking them back. And then I started dealing from the bottom of the deck, and I was like, I really have to go to bed because I'm cheating. And they don't know. And I kind of feel good about it. And I think that is the other side, as much as I rant and as much as I talk about kind of these larger issues, is that we do have to remember the reason why we're here, the reason why we do love sports is because it is fun. And because we really do enjoy it. And we want our children to have that same joy that we have. And if we don't stand up, I always say, if we don't stand up and the people who get it, if we don't stand up and do something about it and stand up and speak out about it, who's going to? So it is an absolute joy to be able to have this time. And I appreciate Tori and Mike and Cheney for inviting me here and allowing me to be a part of the birth of this organization. And I think there are others, organizations out there that are doing it. I think many of them are conflicted because they're looking at it by trying to save sports as is. And I think what, I was listening to Tori's comments about lifting up and impacting the culture to what we want it to be. And I think that is where it needs to go. So I'm honored to be here and to be able to be a part of this. And for the couple of days, but I'm sure this is something I have the sneaking suspicion that either I'm coming back or you all are coming to New York or something. We're going to meet in between. But I know that, and I apologize, Tori, I know that I talk a lot. What's that? But are there any questions or comments or? And by the way, when I say questions, I didn't say this at the very beginning because usually I say this definitely when I do workshops around men's violence against women, working with men, that if people disagree with me, please don't let that be a part of your question and your comment.
Mr. McPherson?
Yes.
A little bit off point for your main point, but Ohio State, the budget for their athletics bigger than the two biggest cities. What are your thoughts more about that? I mean, like here in Oregon, I guess the football program pays for itself, quote unquote, although I always wonder what that really means. And my alma mater, University of Colorado, looks with great envy upon the Ducks because they can't really manage to sell enough tickets for the program to pay for itself. Yeah. But of course, money pours into it from a lot of sources. It's sort of an economic engine for a university. The money pours in, pours back out, attracts other kinds of money. But what does it do? It builds this like sense of importance around this amateur sport. It's kind of sick, isn't it?
You know what? You know what? On the one hand, I agree with you. Like I say, it's kind of sick and it's kind of crazy. But on the other hand, you know, as much as I can say that, and I appreciate where that's coming from, I don't live in Ohio. And anyone that I know from the state of Ohio, they love The Ohio State University.
Yeah, well,
Right. So wait, but let me finish. So as much as I can say now, I promise you, I'll get back to kind of the point of the economics of it. But there is something that the people in Ohio who vote, who pay their taxes, that go to the state university, have a say in this, right? And so I'm not going to sit here and either disparage or to condemn the people of Ohio for allowing this kind of sick thing to go on, right? Because they're a party to it. And they take a tremendous amount of pride in their Ohio State. I've been there for games. I mean, it is 100,000 people. You talk about the cities that we're talking about. Half of those cities end up fitting in the stadium on game day.
It's no different here in Eugene.
Right.
I mean, the Ducks are like a culture here.
So, but let me just kind of finish that statement. Is that I can sit back and have my perspective on whether it's the misallocation of funds or the kind of, you know, we see it now in the city of New York where we're building in a city that talking about how the economy is impacting New York and Wall Street and all that, and we're giving $100 million to George Steinbrenner to build a new Yankee Stadium, right up the street from a new Mets Stadium, right? So this kind of madness that we all live in is in a lot of different places. So I'll say that in response to your point about that. You know, kind of that it's sick, right? But at the same time, I also know what the Yankees and the Mets and Ohio State mean to people there,
Right.
and they may say, you know what, I don't have a problem with it.
Right.
So I have to back off, right? I can say it. This is an example of, you know, where we are. But at the same time, I will say this, that I believe what is going to happen, and I think that a lot of things have a way of working themselves out and correcting themselves to a certain degree. I believe that we are moving towards a point in college athletics that, you know, as they say, the jig is up. You know, this is bless you. This is a nonprofit academic institution, right, that is making millions of dollars, and how that happens with the NCAA and all that is a really interesting little dynamic. And at some point, it's going to get to the point where you say, Ohio State, really, is your athletic program part of a nonprofit organization when you're generating that kind of dollar? And I think what's going to happen, and this is just kind of a process point, is that the top schools in football and basketball are going to create some sort of league that is outside of not necessarily outside of higher education, because I think they'll be a part of affiliated with the University of Oregon, but they're going to be academics is going to be deferred. And, this is just my personal feeling, because the money is not going away. Right? And so we can sit here and we can say, we got to fight the money, and the money's not going to go away. And because people are paying it.
Well, like I say, it cycles around too. I mean, it's sort of like, it's almost harmless money in a way. I mean, people buy the tickets and it goes into the program and then it gets spent on stuff, you know.
And that stuff attracts more athletes to come here and compete. Right. And then we feel good when we go out and see that volleyball team and they're doing real well. We know that they're here because the facilities here are better than they are in Corvallis.
I want to go clear down the other end.
Okay.
I want to talk about a few years ago, there was an organization in this town called Kids Sports. Actually, you talked about sexist at the beginning. It was the Eugene Boys Athletic Association. We finally let girls in. But there was, this organization was really struggling to stay in business. And the reason it was is because it no longer was a place where every kid could play. And you started the game, one game, you couldn't start the next game, and it became, wait a minute, our kids aren't good enough to go to college. So all of a sudden it became an organization that I described when I was out trying to raise some money for it. This is an organization where if you can't play and you can't pay, you still get a chance to be a part of the team. But we have separated so much into, if you have enough money, and or you're really good, you can be on this team. But if you don't, then I'm not exactly sure where you play. And how do we get the University of Oregon and the Nikes of the world to start really walking the talk, making it okay to have a really good athlete like you bring along a kid that can't walk and chew gum at the same time and make them both feel good about being on the same team.
You're not kidding. That is exactly the point that I was making earlier where this woman said that her son wasn't good enough to play and we have travel teams that are separating out. I think that is, I think that question is no different than the Ohio State question. Bless you. Than the Ohio State question in that we really have gotten to a point, even with children, that it is, the standards for them are no different. I mean, you heard that one student athlete, and he was a student athlete, I'm assuming, in the film, no? Who said, if you can't take it, go home, right? I mean, there is that sentiment in sport that you either win or you go home, right? And there's also that sentiment that a lot of people believe that's what sport does, right? You can do this or you can't, go home. And it's not about, it's not about everyone gets a chance to play. It's about the athletes get a chance to play. And that's why we have the specialization at an early age. And so I will say to you that, and because I've been on both sides of the argument at times, we're saying, why doesn't the University of Oregon and why doesn't Nike do something about that? But it's not just those larger institutions doing something about that. It is the community doing something about that. Because at the end of the day, that's how we treat our children. And I don't think that the University of Oregon and Nike really are, and I say this almost in defense of them, but I don't say so much in defense of them as I say more in our responsibility. And by the way, I would say that the University of Oregon is doing something with the very reason we're here tonight, to start to address that, to start to pull people in and educate people on how do you create a league that is competitive, how do you create a league that is viable for all kids, and kids either don't have the means or the skills to participate. And I mean, then I can get into all the layers of then where do you find the coaches to coach those kids, the volunteer coaches who you're not going to pay to coach those kids, and all that, and the facilities to stay open. And maybe these are some of the issues that you dealt with this program. But I will tell you that this is not a Eugene, Oregon issue or a phenomenon dynamic. This is across the board, across our country, that we are discarding kids. About 5 years ago, I believe, and maybe I'm off of my years because somehow I'm getting older and they just keep flying by. The Michigan State Center for Youth Sports, released a study that by the age of 13, 70% of kids involved in youth sports were dropping out by the age of 13. And what's frightening about that was that at the time of the study was the, I can't say the height because I think it's still happening, but it was the height of involvement of youth sports, of this belief that sports builds character in team, you're going to get a scholarship and all that. So you had more girls participating in sports. It was after the women's soccer team won the gold medal in the Olympics and hockey, and so there were more young girls participating in sports. When the Sports Foundation released studies about the efficacy of girls in sports, less likely to be pregnant as teens, more likely to go on to a four-year institution, more likely to graduate on time, all these great benefits to girls. And so there was a time when more and more kids were playing sports and then dropping out at a higher rate by the age of 13. And it was because of this hyper competitive environment that was not educating them, not teaching them, not building them up, but breaking them down. So it's not just a Eugene phenomena that we're dealing with. It is very much in a message in the larger culture. And we also, I think, in the larger culture, even outside of sports, say to kids that if you're not good enough to play, and we tell them in some very ways, in different ways in the culture, don't waste your time with that, because those people don't want you anyway. And that message gets delivered in other ways. So I just to kind of answer your question, I think what Competition on Conflict is trying to do is to address that. And so I would say to you that what can the University of Oregon do? I think the University of Oregon is doing something. And I think this is it. Yes, sir.
My question is, how would you suggest to encourage individuals that might excel in sports without having those same individuals with the zero-sum policy? Because I think I come from an athletic background, and I always want to do the best that I can. But in today's society, if I'm pushed towards excelling as much as I can as an athlete, then it automatically has to be at the expense of someone else.
Right.
So how do you promote excellence
Yeah.
without being counted?
Right. Your question reminds me of what I think I mentioned this afternoon at the luncheon. When I talk about you throw like a girl, and I had this football player say, well, if your son threw like a girl, wouldn't you do something about it? And it was a good question for a second. And then I said, well, I went into a whole lesson about physiology, right? Because girls and boys physiologically, if you teach them to throw, girls will throw better than boys, as girls and boys, not men and women. Girls will throw better if taught because they're just more physiologically advanced as girls as opposed to boys, right? So, and by the way, girls listen. I'm trying teaching somebody how to throw a football is very different because your natural arm motion comes this way, and like baseballs and everything else you throw, football you throw this way, right? So to teach, I've taught girls and boys to throw football, and girls will go, okay, my finger has to be, this one has to be the last one, and they get very particular, and boys go, yeah. Right? And you know it's true. And you just go, no, I said stand still, but I'm this guy. Right? And it's like they tell their friends, go way out there. I'm like, no, 5 yards. Girls will actually listen. 5 yards, is that right here? Right? The second thing is, I'm not going to make my son any better by degrading my daughter. Right? So what I have to do is I have to check that, and I have to begin to think and ask the question that you just asked, is how do I then teach a guy or a girl to be a tough warrior and tough person in sports without teaching all those other things, right? And it's one of the reasons why I love saying that I'm a feminist and a Hall of Famer, because it's not about being very narrow in who they are. It's teaching them their sport in context, and teaching them that they are more than just an athlete, a swimmer, a track and field person. But there's so much more. That's why I talk about that narrowness of masculinity. There's also that narrowness of sport, that this is all you are. We don't have to teach kids the passion of it. We don't have to teach kids to get up. No one said to me, you're going to have to get up at 5 when I was 8 years old when I started playing football. You're going to have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and walk in the dark and carry a stick. Because you know that dog on the corner of Pine Brook Avenue in Champlain? That dog is out at 5 a.m., right? You don't have to, because they don't watch that dog. No one told me all that stuff. I found that stuff out. You know why? Because I was a kid who just wanted to, like you just said, I wanted to succeed. And I was validated by that talent that I had. But it was also when I came home and my mother said, all right, put the stick down, go do your homework. But coach told me I'm going to start. Well, you're going to start by doing your homework. You're going to start to take the garbage out, right? and so it was saying that those things didn't give you a pass. And what happens with a lot of athletes, and what happens now, going back to the point where we identify these kids, whether they're good or not. I was not, people would say, oh yeah, I was a good athlete when I was a kid. I was not. I was average. I was scared. I tell the story to kids. I ran up the field crying 2 years in a row in Little League. I was afraid to play. Literally ran up the field, tears in my eyes, crying, embarrassed, and ran up the field before Little League started, right? So I wasn't this star that just because I could, I was 8 years old and people thought I was going to be a star. My brothers were playing it really good. Everyone thought I was going to be like them. I was embarrassed. It was horrible, right? My father even gave up on me. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Seriously. But it was because I liked to play that I got better at it. And no one had to teach me how to do all those things. But I was raised in a family where I was respectful to other people, and that my education was important. And that I wasn't just that. Although what happened for me was I was lucky enough to be the last one of 5, and so they kind of didn't pay much attention to me. And I flew underneath the radar. But I see other athletes where they get identified at an early age, and all of a sudden, you know who the worst people are for that athlete? Sometimes we hear about agents or we hear about people in the community who want to hang on. The worst people are their family. Because when your family sees you as being someone that all of a sudden the whole family can be proud of, you can go to UO. Is that what y'all call it, right? UO. You go to U of O, you're gonna make so proud. And that pressure and that your identity just gets even more shrunk down to this. This is what the expectation is. And I see it, time and time again. There's a young man on Long Island he was an amazing football player, and he played a half a season at West Virginia. Pete Carroll called him from the locker room after they won the national championship when he was in high school. He said he was an amazing running back. Emmett Burn in West Virginia lasted about 10 weeks. Fell out of there and didn't even go to class. They kicked him out before the season was over. And he was playing as a true freshman. Ended up back on Long Island, went to community college, got kicked out of community college before the spring was over. I just read in the paper the other day, he's still trying to play at one of the colleges, but they're saying if he goes to class, well, and you know who the biggest, and I followed it because he's on Long Island, I know the family, I know people in the district, it was his family. He was a meal ticket. He was a meal ticket. And there was no one there to even help the family. So in many cases, when we talk about those things you're talking about, it's not just the individual athlete, it is the larger culture, it is the family. Because this is the parent who hears about, I remember going to see my mother, who was a school nurse, and going to see her at her school. And the whole school knew who I was, and my brothers. And so my mother walked into that environment every day. No one talked to my mother about how to deal with that. And we were fortunate enough to be in a place where she had a lot of people around her who were level-headed, but for some people who don't have that, it becomes that identity. It's even more pressure on that kid.
So we have time for one more brief question with a brief answer.
I cannot promise that. That's like a what?
You touched on, I'm sorry, somebody raised their hand.
Yeah. Well, I came out here, my wife works here, and she was telling me about this. And I coached Power 1 for 6 years, and you see the crazy parents and the crazy coaches. And, something like this is very necessary, especially for the kids, because, there's stat teams, and, man, and people do anything they can to win. And they don't care if they beat a team 54-0. And these are little kids, ages 5 to 14.